Welcome to the deep dive. Take a moment and just consider how our world feels right now. On one hand, we are undeniably hyper-connected.
Hmm.
You can easily order something from thousands of miles away or video call someone instantly on the other side of the planet. Yet, at the very same time, it feels incredibly fragmented.
It really does.
Borders are constantly in the news, new conflicts erupt, and global power dynamics seem to shift almost daily. It's a dizzying mix of connection and division, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
So how do we begin to make sense of these powerful, often unseen forces that truly shape global events?
That's precisely what we're here to unravel today. This deep dive is all about pulling back the curtain on what our sources call geopolitical architectures, the fundamental structures and relationships that govern global political and economic change.
Okay.
Our mission, as always, is to sift through the insights from the material you shared, extracting those crucial nuggets of knowledge. Think of it as your shortcut to truly understanding this complex topic, maybe with a few surprising facts and hopefully enough humor to keep you hooked.
And for this particular deep dive, we've been immersing ourselves in some truly insightful analysis, especially from Klaus Dodd's Geopolitics, a very short introduction.
Ah, yes, a great source.
It offers a really sharp way of looking at how the world works, and maybe more importantly, why it works that way. It's a fascinating lens, really, through which to view our interconnected yet often conflicted world.
It truly is. And a significant part of understanding global political and economic change, particularly since, well, the 1980s or so, revolves around one dominant concept: globalization.
It really became almost a buzzword, didn't it? If you followed global affairs over the last few decades, globalization has been the most important shorthand term used by everyone, from political leaders to journalists and academics. What made it so, well, dominant?
It practically dominated academic and policymaking discussions,
Yeah.
becoming the go-to term for describing global change. You saw leaders like President Bill Clinton in the 1990s readily embracing it, often presenting it as this unstoppable, almost, magical force.
Right.
The initial assumption was that globalization was fundamentally transforming the world, making territory and international borders appear less significant. You even had commentators like Richard O'Brien coining the phrase "end of geography," suggesting the physical distance and national boundaries would simply, well, fade away in this hyper-connected world.
That's a bold prediction, but it almost feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like, if the world is so interconnected, how exactly do borders, which seem like these physical constraints, maintain their enduring significance?
And that's precisely where our deep dive offers a crucial counterargument. While the idea of the end of geography certainly gained traction, the reality is far more nuanced. Our sources emphasize that globalization doesn't erode the significance of borders and territory. Instead, it coexists with a dynamic geopolitical architecture.
Ah, okay, coexists.
Exactly. This coexistence leads to continuous reconfigurations of how our world is organized. The post-Cold War era, in particular, has seen intense scrutiny on how we define the roles and responsibilities of states and international organizations, precisely because these forces are interacting in such complex ways. It's not an either situation, it's very much a both hand.
So if it's not the end of geography, but a reconfiguration, then we need to understand what's really going on. What is globalization, really? I mean, it's a term thrown around so much it can kind of lose its meaning.
You're right to ask. At its core, globalization refers to the increasing movement of people, ideas, technology, and goods from place to place across the globe. And critically, these movements have profound implications for human relations. It's not exactly a new phenomenon, but its intensity has certainly increased dramatically over time.
So when did this intensification really begin to pick up speed? Can we trace it back?
Our sources point to the 15th and 16th centuries as a period where these flows became progressively more intense. And it's vital, really, to acknowledge that this intensification often had severe implications, particularly for native populations in what would later be described as the first, second, and third worlds.
Right, the colonial era.
Precisely. European powers like the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, British, and French were at the forefront of this global enterprise. This period saw what's referred to as the colonial encounter, which initiated a truly global trade in commodities and, tragically, people, including slaves.
That's a powerful and often painful historical context.
Yeah.
Were there specific entities driving this early globalization? Like, who was actually doing it?
Absolutely. Think of global entities like the Dutch East India Company. They built their headquarters in places like Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta in Indonesia. These companies, often with the support of their imperial sponsors, were instrumental in constructing and administering these vast, complex trading networks that span continents.
Yeah.
Then, by the 19th century, a new continental power, the United States, began to make its presence felt.
Mm.
And this wasn't just about territorial expansion within North America, but also flows of people, goods, and ideas extending outwards, alongside significant territorial acquisition in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean.
And as this global economy started taking shape, did it require more coordination? I imagine it got pretty chaotic otherwise.
Exactly. The growing interconnectedness necessitated increased international coordination. A great example of this is the 1884 International Meridian Conference.
Ah, yes.
This conference established Greenwich as the prime meridian, which was a critical step in facilitating a new world map of agreed-upon time zones. I mean, imagine trying to coordinate global trade, shipping, or communication without a standardized system of time.
Impossible, really.
Pretty much. Then, the 20th century really ramped things up. It bore witness to even greater forms of social, political, and cultural connectivity. Advances in aviation, automobiles, and crucially, containerization dramatically shrunk distances and increased the speed and volume of global flows.
So by the end of the century, with all this acceleration, this idea that physical geography maybe didn't matter as much became almost, well, commonplace wisdom.
Exactly. The journalist Thomas Friedman, for instance, he saw the year 2000 as a high watermark of globalization, particularly due to software technology and the internet bringing people and objects ever closer together.
Right, the world is flat and all that.
Precisely. Former President Bill Clinton himself reflected on this in January 2002, noting the explosive growth of the World Wide Web from just 50 sites in 1993 to over 350 million by the time he left office. The pace was truly mind-boggling, and it really solidified that perception that physical distance was rapidly becoming irrelevant.
Okay, so if some people were proclaiming the end of geography and the internet was bringing us all so close, how exactly do borders, which seem like these very real physical things, maintain their enduring significance? What are we missing here?
That's a crucial point. While the end of geography was indeed proclaimed, the very geographies of globalization have, maybe paradoxically, highlighted the enduring significance of borders, distance, interconnection, and importantly, responsibilities. Our sources argue that states have actively managed the relationship between their national territories and the accompanying flows of people, goods, ideas, and money since, well, at least the 17th century. This practice continued with European states and later with the United States. The 19th century, as observed by scholars like Garrett Gong, even saw the establishment of standards of civilization.
Standards of civilization, what does that mean exactly?
Well, these were criteria by which European states not only shaped the international system, but also determined how new states could achieve legal recognition via a form of earned sovereignty. This concept of earned sovereignty, in its many forms, is an essential element of globalization because it helps to provide the rules and expectations for the global order.
Okay, so setting the terms of membership, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The United States, as a great power, has been at the forefront of establishing such an international legal order. It was instrumental in creating post-1945 institutions like the United Nations and the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For example, the UN Charter explicitly stipulates that states accept the Security Council's right to determine what constitutes threats to international peace and security, and that states must comply with relevant resolutions.
Right, giving the system some teeth.
Theoretically, yes. But what's fascinating here is that historically, there's always been a significant gulf between legal sovereignty and de facto sovereignty. Meaning, in practice, sovereignty has frequently been abused, divided, and shared, even if legally it's recognized on paper.
And that gulf has become alarmingly clear in recent years, hasn't it? Especially thinking about the actions of the George W. Bush administration between 2001 and 2009. How did their approach illustrate this tension?
Indeed. The Bush administration was widely perceived as, well, indifferent to these constraining international structures. In its efforts to control and eradicate flows of terrorists and their funding, it often acted with a disregard for established international norms.
Right, the war on terror footing.
Exactly. While it's true that Bush's policies correlated with the lack of additional major terror events within the United States, they largely failed to prevent other flows and networks from inflicting terrible losses of life and infrastructure in places like the Middle East and Central Asia. The crucial point here is that the Bush administration explicitly sought to re-territorialize the world, to forcefully redraw and simplify the global map. This often took the form of simplistic spatial frameworks, such as the infamous axis of evil.
Yeah, I remember that.
The key takeaway here is that even the most powerful nations, when faced with overwhelming threats, often default to trying to simplistically redraw the map, rather than grappling with the inherent complexities of global flows. It reflects this strategy of trying to freeze geographical space, to impose a rigid order in the hope of promoting a sense of geopolitical stability and cultural reassurance in what feels like a highly fluid world. This brings us to a more formal definition of geopolitical architecture. It describes the ways in which states and non-state organizations access, manage, and regulate the intersection of territories and flows. In doing so, they essentially establish and reinforce borders, not just physical ones, but conceptual ones too, that define inside-outside, citizen-alien, and domestic-international.
So it's not just about drawing lines on a map, but actively controlling who and what crosses those lines, and fundamentally who belongs where. It's about managing the flow.
Exactly. Governments, for instance, invest heavily in the regulation of borders because they serve as the primary entry and exit points into national territory. These border controls become a very significant element in demonstrating effective sovereignty.
Like airport security.
Precisely. Think about the summer of 2006, when the British government introduced new, highly visible security measures at all its airports following the uncovering of a plot to blow up a number of planes.
I remember that too, the liquid ban.
Exactly. That security alert served as a pretext for new measures designed to increase the monitoring and surveillance of passengers. Now, while we can't definitively judge its long-term effectiveness, controlling the mobility of passengers in such a tightly defined space is one of the more obvious everyday manifestations of this geopolitical architecture at work. Ultimately, concepts and processes associated with globalization, sovereignty, and international law are fundamental to shaping this intricate architecture of global politics.
That makes a lot of sense. So, with this geopolitical architecture in mind, how do ideas of national sovereignty truly inform state activities? And perhaps more importantly, how have those ideas been challenged or even, well, violated in practice?
Sovereignty is absolutely critical in shaping the prevailing geopolitical architecture, which, as we've discussed, is based on states, borders, and national territories. However, as scholars like Stephen Krasner have observed, national governments, while publicly endorsing the importance of sovereignty, have quite frequently violated those very ideas and principles, even those that are incorporated into the founding charter of the United Nations.
So, saying one thing and doing another, basically.
Sometimes, yes. The United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 is a recent and stark illustration of that willingness to violate the national sovereignty of another country, even while simultaneously stressing the significance of territorial integrity in other contexts. But there are many other historical examples. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan back in 1979. What's even more fascinating, perhaps, is that sometimes governments willingly allow their national sovereignty to be, let's say, porous. This happens when they encourage certain flows, such as foreign investment, skilled people, or ideas that might technically cross their sovereign boundaries but are seen as beneficial. For example, since the enlargement of the European Union, the British government, at the time, actively encouraged labor migration from countries like Poland and Slovakia, demonstrating a deliberate choice to allow such flows.
And what about when a state is simply too weak to protect its own sovereignty? Does the international community step in then? Or is supposed to?
That's another complex scenario. In other cases, governments might find themselves in such dire circumstances that they appeal for humanitarian and/or military intervention when faced with overwhelming evidence of human rights violation and suffering within their borders. The tragic situation facing the Bosnian government in 1992, confronted by Serbian military aggression, provides a poignant example.
Right, during the Balkan Wars.
Exactly. Their appeals to the European Union and the United States largely failed to catalyze a sufficiently large military force or to lift an arms embargo until 1995. It took years for determined action to end the violation of Bosnian national territory and the suffering of the communities within it. Since then, the Dayton Peace Plan, designed for Bosnia, has been monitored by a United Nations-appointed High Representative. This highlights the complex, often tragic interplay between a state's appeal to its sovereignty and the international community's response that isn't always immediate or uniform. So, in thinking about sovereignty, our sources suggest it's helpful to maybe distinguish four different interpretations, helping us understand its complex role in the real world.
Okay, let's dive into these. What's the first interpretation? Break it down for us.
Okay, the first refers to international legal sovereignty. This manifests in things like a state's membership in the United Nations, its ability to negotiate and ratify treaties, and the general conduct of diplomacy.
So the formal stuff. Recognition on the world stage.
Precisely. At the heart of this is the fundamental notion that states recognize other states as having an inherent capacity to conduct international relations. Even if governments detest a state or its political leadership, and this happens a lot, this basic recognition is fundamental. For instance, in the weeks and months leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the United States and its allies still had to negotiate and engage with Saddam Hussein's diplomatic representatives at the United Nations.
Even though they were planning to invade.
Exactly. However, this interpretation also highlights challenges. Some states might not recognize the capacity of others precisely because those countries are deemed unable to manage their national territories or secure internal order. Terms like failing states or quasi-states are used for countries in regions like West and Central Africa, think Somalia, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Western governments often represent these states as inadequate, implying they can't regulate flows of drugs, money, or arms trafficking. It's interesting, early geopolitical writers like Keynes actually objected to this excessively legalistic conception of sovereignty, arguing it neglected the vast geographical variations in global politics. So the core insight here is that while a state might be legally recognized, its practical capacity to govern can differ wildly, leading to very different real-world outcomes.
So the first type is about legal recognition. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. How does intense globalization with all its interconnectedness affect this idea of sovereignty? That sounds like the second interpretation you mentioned.
It is. The second interpretation considers sovereignty as conditioned by interdependence. In this era of intense globalization, it's really unhelpful, our sources argue, to presume that states enjoy exclusive, absolute control over their territories and the accompanying flows of people and goods.
Yeah, seems impossible.
It pretty much is. Even the most powerful countries, like the United States and China, have had to recognize that while interdependence hasn't completely eroded state sovereignty, it has undeniably modified politics and policymaking. Countries respond to this interdependence in various ways. In areas of national security, for example, they might enhance governmental control, or, in the case of the European Union, regional control through strict immigration policies and surveillance.
Okay. Tighten the screws in some areas.
Right. Yet in other areas, they might engage in pooling sovereignty, essentially sharing or even conceding formal sovereign power, as seen in human rights protection or economic cooperation, like joining international courts or trade agreements. As former British Prime Minister Tony Blair said in Buenos Aires back in 2005, there is universal agreement now that the characteristic of the modern world is interdependence. But we haven't yet had time to think through its consequences or understood that the international rulebook has been ripped up.
Wow. That's quite a statement.
It really captures the complexity of this evolving landscape, doesn't it? Where absolute control is largely a myth, and cooperation often demands a flexible approach to national power.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, what's the third way to look at sovereignty then? After legal and interdependence.
The third interpretation considers sovereignty in purely domestic terms, acknowledging that some states are simply better able to exercise control over their national territories than others. The contrast here can be, well, stark.
Give us an example.
Comparing the United States with the Democratic Republic of Congo provides a vivid illustration. The DRC has been consumed by a series of conflicts since the late 1990s, leading to millions of deaths, mass rape, and widespread destruction. The national government based in Kinshasa simply does not exercise effective control over its vast territory, which tragically has emboldened other countries to contribute to its instability by funding rival militias.
That's horrific.
It is. Now, during the Cold War, the country, then called Zaire under Mobutu, maintained some domestic sovereignty thanks to a well-funded armed force supported by mineral and oil exports. This was tolerated by the U.S. because Mobutu was seen as a vital anti-communist ally. But that fragile stability changed dramatically after his death in 1997. However, and this is key, even powerful countries like the United States, with its well-established infrastructures and administrative structures, struggle to exercise complete sovereign control. Immigration control, particularly along the U.S.-Mexican border, is a prime example.
Right, that's always in the headlines.
Always.
Yeah.
Despite significant investment in personnel, vehicles, and sensory equipment, the U.S. Border Patrol struggles daily to regulate the movement of people across the Rio Grande and through the desert regions of the Southwest. This difficulty has even led to the creation of vigilante groups, such as the Minuteman Project, who patrol the border themselves. These groups often voice concerns beyond just immigration, extending to the status of Anglophone America versus the growing Spanish-speaking communities in the Southwest. But what's often overlooked, our sources note, is the vital role these immigrants play in supporting America's agricultural, manufacturing, and service sectors, often filling low-paid, insecure jobs.
Hmm. The economic reality versus the political rhetoric.
Exactly. The core insight here is that even for the strongest states, absolute domestic control remains an elusive ideal, constantly challenged by human movement and economic realities.
Fascinating. And finally, what's the fourth interpretation of sovereignty? We've had legal, interdependence, domestic. What's left?
The fourth and final interpretation of sovereignty we're looking at is non-intervention. This principle, developed by the Swiss jurist Emmerich de Vattel back in the 18th century, posits that states should be able to conduct their own affairs without intervention from outside powers.
The right to be left alone, basically.
Essentially, yes. For states emerging from the shadow of European colonialism, this was a particularly significant concept, facilitating the creation of post-colonial governments and asserting their independence on the world stage. However, like the others, this principle has frequently been violated throughout history. American and Soviet administrations, for example, often interfered in the affairs of other countries, especially those in the so-called Third World.
The Cold War battlegrounds.
Precisely. This interference took many forms: military invasions, economic blockades, cultural penetration, political marginalization, and/or sanctions. The United States invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965 and destabilized Chile in 1973, largely out of fear that more socialist governments would emerge in the Americas after the successful 1959 Cuban Revolution. Similarly, the Soviets sent tanks into Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968 to crush reformist governments, challenging their sphere of influence. In other areas, though, such as human rights protection, many states have actively encouraged a qualification of the non-intervention principle. They argue that sovereignty shouldn't be a shield for mass atrocities.
The responsibility to protect idea.
Exactly, R2P.
Yeah.
Despite this, the international community, as represented by the UN Security Council's permanent members, hasn't always responded readily to evidence of massive human rights violations and genocide, such as in Darfur, Sudan, despite agitation from pressure groups and other states. It's often slow and politically charged.
Yeah.
Yet there are exceptions. In April 1999, NATO forces bombed Serbian positions in Kosovo. This intervention was justified by the protagonists on the grounds that Serbia was violating its own national sovereignty by engaging in massacres of the Kosovo Muslim community. Critics, however, highlighted the lack of UN Security Council authorization for this particular intervention.
So, intervention, but controversial.
Very. This also brings up accusations of selectivity. NATO countries have been criticized for being unwilling to intervene when Muslim communities suffer human rights violations elsewhere, such as in Palestine or the disputed region of Kashmir. Critics often conclude that the principle of non-intervention is more likely to be discarded if the parties suspected of human rights violations or even genocide neither possess substantial military forces, including nuclear weapons, nor a network of powerful allies like Israel enjoys with U.S. support.
So, power politics still plays a huge role.
Undeniably. This dynamic led to that significant development in 2005 you mentioned. The UN Summit Outcome document, particularly Articles 138 and 139, concluded that other states should intervene in exceptional circumstances, articulating the principle of a responsibility to protect, R2P, which places responsibilities on both potential interveners and the targets of intervention. So while non-intervention is a bedrock principle, it's constantly tested and qualified by the brutal realities of human rights abuses and global power dynamics.
So, what this all really shows us is that while sovereignty is the bedrock principle, it's constantly being pulled in different directions, legally recognized yet practically constrained by global forces, inconsistently applied domestically, and often violated internationally. The core insight seems to be sovereignty is rarely absolute, and its real-world application is far more fluid and, frankly, selective than we often imagine. Let's look at a real-world illustration, like the situation with Iran and nuclear weapons, specifically in the context of 2007 when our source was written. How did these principles clash there?
That's an excellent case study to highlight these tensions. In January 2007, Israeli and British newspapers were reporting that Israel believed military action against Iranian nuclear facilities was necessary. The analysis being reported was stark. Iran cannot be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon capability. Straight interventionist talk.
And how did Iran react to that kind of pressure?
Well, from Iran's perspective, This kind of talk is deeply provocative. They are a country deeply sensitive about how they've been pressurized and threatened by outsiders in the past. Think about the Western support for the 1953 coup that overthrew their democratically elected leader, or the U.S. backing Saddam Hussein in the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s.
Right, long memories.
Very long memories. From their viewpoint, any talk of violating their territorial integrity, their sovereignty, will only further enhance domestic support for their nuclear program. It becomes a nationalist issue. Our sources detail Iran's geographical imagination, how they see themselves in the world as composed of two main elements. First, Iran sees itself as a regional power with a long history of extraterritorial influence throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Like Britain, Iran is also a former imperial power, and that shapes its outlook.
Okay, a sense of regional entitlement almost.
Perhaps. Second, Iran perceives itself as a besieged country and culture, surrounded by Arabic-speaking neighbors and hostile powers like Israel, which is, of course, backed by the United States.
So both powerful and vulnerable in their own view.
Exactly. The analysis in our source concludes that any attempt to engage with Iran must recognize this complex context. It suggests that military bombing, attempts at regime change, or further isolation are unlikely to persuade conservatives in Iran that nuclear weapons acquisition is anything but a shrewd strategic decision for their security and national standing. It's a classic example of a state asserting its sovereignty and regional aspirations in the face of perceived external threats, using the very principles we've been discussing. And this brings us to a broader point about varying state capacities and global reach. Some states are far better able to exercise effective sovereignty, meaning they can truly control and administer their national territories and effectively regulate the flows of money, people, goods, ideas, and technology. They have strong domestic control. Then there are states with greater extraterritorial capacities, like the United States and China, which are able to conduct genuinely globalized relations. They have the reach military, economic, cultural, to interfere and engage with other states, communities, and regions on a global scale.
Projecting power outwards.
Precisely. This capacity, as Halford Mackinder, one of the earliest geopolitical thinkers, noted way back, was expected to characterize the post-Columbian era. He observed that the world was being compressed by new technologies, especially in transportation, leading to more intense relationships. This concept of time-space compression and, more broadly, globalization beautifully encapsulates these profound shifts in the human experience. It's about how the world feels smaller and connections become deeper, impacting everyone differently, depending on their capacity and position in the system.
Okay, so if traditional geopolitics was so much about states and empires, what's really new now in this age of intense globalization? How has the focus shifted beyond just national governments? It feels like there are more players on the board.
That's an excellent question, and it's key to understanding contemporary global geopolitics.
Yeah.
To really grasp how things have changed since Mackinder's era, we need to examine how states, but also other actors, have responded to, resisted, and regulated the processes associated with globalization.
Okay.
While traditional geopolitical thinking was indeed preoccupied with states and the changing fortunes of European empires, more recent writings have broadened the scope considerably. They now extensively explore the significant role of non-state actors, think NGOs, terrorist groups, social movements, complex networks, regional organizations like the EU, powerful transnational corporations, often called TNCs, and international governmental organizations, or IGOs, like the UN or the WTO.
So a much more crowded and complex picture.
Definitely. While states and fundamental concepts like sovereignty remain highly significant, our sources highlight that a vast web of interdependence is fundamentally changing international relations and the accompanying global geographies. It's now commonly understood that states have increasingly permeable borders and that governance is expressed in a more global and polycentric manner, meaning governance is now shared across many different centers of power globally, not just residing solely in national capitals.
Polycentric, multiple centers.
Exactly. This means that institutions like the World Bank, the United Nations, global media corporations, and the World Trade Organization all play their part in shaping global behavior, alongside states. The notion of intensity is really important here, because there's mounting evidence that states have had to adapt to an ever-growing list of issues and flows that possess the ability to transcend international boundaries and exclusive sovereignties. This list would undoubtedly include critical challenges like global climate change, human rights issues, illicit drug trafficking, pandemics, financial crises, and the ever-present specter of nuclear annihilation. No single state can tackle these alone. Now, over the last 60 years or so, a particular form of global order emerged following the defeat of Japan and Germany in 1945. This order was largely sponsored by the victorious United States and its key allies, including Britain. Our sources characterize this post-1945 order by three key features.
Okay, what were they?
First, there was the development of a global capitalist economy. The United States was instrumental in creating a new economic order, spearheaded by the establishment of two crucial institutions, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank.
Bretton Woods institutions, right?
Exactly. These bodies, first conceptualized at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, had a dual aim: to establish international economic stability and to provide funds for post-war reconstruction, particularly in Europe. The Bretton Woods system of international monetary management, in place from 1944 to 1971, was intended to establish the rules governing post-war commercial and financial relations, explicitly designed to banish aggressive forms of economic nationalism that had contributed to the wars.
How did it work?
Well, 44 nations agreed that each country's currency exchange rate would remain within a fixed value banding, pegged ultimately to the US dollar, which was convertible to gold. The IMF managed this system to promote global financial stability. However, the system collapsed in 1971 when the United States, under President Nixon, suspended the conversion from dollars to gold, the so-called Nixon shock.
Right.
After 1971, international currencies were no longer tied to fixed exchange rates, leading to a significant increase in international financial flows, currency speculation, and the emergence of major global financial hubs like New York, Paris, and London, dominating this new, more volatile system. Second, the creation of the United Nations in 1945 was instrumental in helping to manage and regulate the behavior of states in the post-war world. The UN Charter played a key role in establishing sovereignty norms like non-intervention, mostly, and other initiatives like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which later became the WTO, sought to promote global free trade by reducing tariffs and barriers. And third, there was the promotion of liberal democracy by the United States as the preferred system of political expression. This was critical in legitimating the U.S. role in the ensuing Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union and China, who, of course, publicly promoted socialist revolutions as an alternative model.
So, capitalism, UN rules, and democracy, the US-led package.
That was the core idea. The consequences of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 and the decline of socialist regimes in Eastern Europe and elsewhere were profound. Institutions with the economic and political imprint of the United States effectively laid the groundwork for and promoted a global capitalist system based on free trade, open markets, and foreign direct investment. Transnational corporations, through their investment and production activities across borders, facilitated the consolidation of this global economic landscape.
That's a comprehensive overview of the post-war order. Let's take a moment for a historical snapshot. Though, how did Europe's geopolitical map actually get redrawn after World War II, fundamentally altering the system that came before?
Yes. The redrawing of Europe's geopolitical map began even before the war officially ended, crucially at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. This meeting, involving Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill in the Crimean resort, effectively determined the fate of post-1945 Europe.
A pivotal moment. What were the key outcomes?
They were significant. The Soviet Union agreed to join the fledgling United Nations in return for recognition of a Soviet sphere of influence, essentially a buffer zone, in Eastern and Central Europe. Germany and Austria would be occupied and divided into 4 sectors, managed by the 3 conference participants plus France. Critically, countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were allowed to remain under Soviet occupation, effectively swallowed into the USSR. Germany was also slated to pay reparations.
So dividing up the continent, really?
Pretty much. This setup, the division symbolized by the Iron Curtain, would fundamentally define Europe for decades. It took another 44 years until the dramatic events of 1989 before the geopolitics of Europe was to be fundamentally altered again. This came with the collapse of the East German regime and other communist governments across Eastern and Central Europe.
The fall of the Berlin Wall.
Exactly. The breaking of the Berlin Wall, which had been built in 1961, stands out as one of the most memorable, iconic moments of that incredible transformation. By the end of the 1990s, the Soviet Union itself had disintegrated entirely. Former Eastern European communist governments had rushed to join the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and Russia itself had formed new, albeit sometimes tense, partnerships with both the EU and NATO. It was a complete overturning of the Yalta-era order, showcasing how quickly established geopolitical architectures can crumble and be remade.
So, with all these global forces at play, the rise and fall of systems, the web of interdependence, what does this all mean for the very idea of the state itself? Is it being eclipsed by these global forces, or is it more accurate to say it's being transformed?
That's a debate that has indeed been much discussed, and our sources touch on both sides. For some, the sheer intensity of global economic and political demands has effectively eclipsed the state.
What's the argument there?
The argument is that economic institutions like the World Bank and IMF wield considerable control over government expenditure and macroeconomic policy, especially in regions like sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, particularly when states need financial assistance. These structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, often impose conditions. Critics would say dictate conditions that might include demands for governments to cut public expenditure on things like health or education, or ease restrictions on foreign investment, effectively opening up their economies.
So, economic leverage eroding sovereignty.
That's the idea. During the Cold War, these international economic arrangements had clear geopolitical implications, as U.S.-dominated international organizations like the IMF gained a greater control and influence over regions considered strategically significant due to their natural resources, like West Africa's oil and natural gas, or their political alignment. Marxist geographer David Harvey even coined the term accumulation by dispossession to describe this.
Accumulation by dispossession. Explain that a bit.
It highlights how international institutions, often acting in concert with powerful states and corporations, facilitated access to third-world markets and resources for powerful external actors. It's essentially like a powerful country or institution clearing the ground, sometimes forcefully through economic pressure, for external players to come in and take control of resources or markets that were previously held or controlled locally. In other regions, like Southeast Asia, international loans were strategically directed toward states considered allies in the struggle against Soviet and/or Chinese-backed socialist ambitions. Countries like South Korea and Malaysia benefited, especially during the Vietnam conflict, driven by American fears of a domino effect if Vietnam fell to communist forces. However, other commentators contend that it's more helpful to think of the state as transformed rather than eclipsed.
Okay, what's that perspective?
Their argument is that international economic organizations like the IMF and powerful transnational corporations are in fact still dependent on their relationship with states, albeit a relationship that has been significantly altered by global flows and networks. After all, states ultimately created the post-war economic and political order, with the United States being the most significant architect. Moreover, fundamental things like property rights, taxation laws, and investment regulations still originate from and are enforced by states. These laws regulate and protect the activities of transnational corporations within and across national jurisdictions.
So, TNC still needs states to operate.
Absolutely. As the economic geographer Peter Dicken has observed, states continue to shape specific business and economic activities. They set the rules of the game. The irony, as our sources point out, is that despite some observers predicting the demise of the state as a direct consequence of intense globalization, there are actually more states than ever in the world today due to decolonization and the breakup of larger states. So the state is certainly changing, adapting, maybe even losing some power in certain areas, but it's far from gone. It's transformed. The implications of all this for geopolitics are profound. On one hand, the ending of the Cold War indeed saw the emergence of new states like Slovenia breaking from Yugoslavia and new regional organizations such as the Commonwealth of Independent States emerging from the wreckage of the USSR. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the gradual incorporation of Russia and China into international economic bodies like the World Trade Organization highlighted how former communist and socialist countries became embedded within the networks and structures associated with global capitalist development.
The neoliberal wave.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Alongside widespread democratization movements in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia and Africa, policies associated with neoliberalism like open markets, privatization, deregulation, and attracting foreign direct investment became hegemonic, the dominant ideology. This fostered a vision of a deregulated world geography, a globe envisioned as a border-free zone specifically designed to encourage flows of investment and goods. The state's role was often intended to be merely a facilitator of business, and some large U.S.-based companies, like Enron before its spectacular collapse, were at one point well able to take full advantage of the relative lack of judicial and fiscal structures in certain areas to maximize profits. During the 1990s, commentators like Francis Fukuyama famously lauded the triumph of these ideas and practices associated with U.S.-sponsored neoliberalism and democracy in his book, The End of History. On the other hand, it also became obvious pretty quickly that democracy, in the form of free elections and elected representatives, was not the norm in all parts of the world. Think China, much of sub-Saharan Africa, and large parts of the Islamic world. Moreover, even those countries considered democratic by some were radically different from Western European and American models.
And not everyone was happy with this neoliberal push, were they?
Not at all. The widespread adoption of economic neoliberalism also attracted a great deal of opposition in many countries, not just in the global south, but also within Western Europe and the United States itself. The emergence of what's called an anti-globalization movement is perhaps one of the most obvious manifestations of that resistance to the hegemonic presence of the United States and its advocated forms of neoliberal global order.
What characterized that movement?
Well, this movement, which is incredibly diverse, encompassing environmentalists, labor unions, anarchists, indigenous groups, religious organizations, is often described as new because these groups appeal to transboundary communities and thus seek to subvert a world based on bounded territories and international frontiers. They use the very tools of globalization, like the internet, to organize resistance against certain aspects of it. These groupings frequently do not seek to establish formal political representation in any one country. They operate more as networks. The most high-profile anti-globalization demonstrations occurred in cities like Cologne, Genoa, London, and Seattle, frequently coinciding with meetings of the WTO or G8 summits. Anti-globalization critics were, and remain, highly critical of the way neoliberalism has, in their view, eroded national boundaries and thus exposed communities to unwanted interference from global corporations, international institutions, and/or hegemonic powers like the U.S.
What were their core concerns?
At the heart of their concern lies the fear that certain kinds of flows, particularly capital flows and corporate power, are overwhelming local places and communities, and that national governments are either unwilling or unable to mitigate those flows as they intersect with territories. They worry about job losses, environmental degradation, loss of cultural identity, and the power of unelected international bodies.
And Seattle 99 was a big moment, wasn't it?
Arguably, one of the most dramatic examples of anti-globalization endeavor occurred in Seattle in November 1999. Timed to coincide with the WTO ministerial meeting, around 60,000 people descended on the Pacific Coast city to register their grievances against corporate globalization, effectively shutting down the meetings and compelling the United States to use its military forces, the National Guard, to restore civic order. The protests continued around the world, and in 2001, a World Social Forum was established in Porto Alegre, Brazil, intended as a counter-summit to the World Economic Forum in Davos, aiming to consolidate and coordinate resistance to these neoliberal forms of globalization. Over 100,000 people attended forum meetings in India and Brazil in 2004 and 2005, respectively, showing the movement's global reach. Now, the anti-globalization movement remains diverse, and although it became partly preoccupied with other anti-war movements after 2001, especially in resisting the war on terror and the occupation of Iraq, its activities have significantly contested and disrupted the prevailing neoliberal economic and political order. The protests in Seattle and elsewhere forced states hosting meetings of the WTO, G8, and World Bank to spend vastly more time and money on security arrangements, creating fortress-like conditions.
An interesting paradox.
It is. However, the post-9/11 era also paradoxically provided new opportunities for rich states and regional organizations, such as the European Union, to consolidate their national boundaries and, as the Doha meeting of the WTO demonstrated in November 2001, to negotiate ever harder to place restrictions on agricultural and industrial exports from the global south, protecting their own markets. So, it shows the complex and often counterintuitive ways these forces interact, where resistance can sometimes lead to unexpected forms of retailization or increased state control.
So we've talked about globalization's impact, the enduring relevance of borders, the nuances of sovereignty, and the resistance to the dominant order. But what about the elephant in the room? The United States. The attacks of September 11, 2001 were commonly described as a major turning point, profoundly shaping global order. How did the U.S. react, and what were the broader geopolitical consequences of that reaction?
Without a doubt, 9/11 was a seismic event. Faced by an unprecedented loss of civilian life within continental America, the Bush administration embarked on what it termed the War on Terror. This was pursued initially in close liaison with allies such as Britain, Pakistan, and Australia, all in the pursuit of those who masterminded the attacks, primarily al-Qaeda and other alleged flows of terror.
The global hunt.
The global hunt, exactly. The diplomatic and military elements of this mission quickly linked Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda was based under Taliban protection, but also implicated Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Sudan, and Syria in various ways, according to the U.S. perspective. Regional allies, including Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, were critical in facilitating intelligence sharing and hosting military operations against elements suspected of being part of terror networks intent on causing destruction and mayhem around the world. This marked a very clear policy shift from the preceding Clinton administration. If you recall, Clinton's approach from 1993 to 2001 emphasized globalization, the power of information, international law, and multilateralism working through international institutions.
Right, engagement and enlargement.
Exactly. In stark contrast, the Bush administration from 2001 to 2009 pivoted sharply to a focus on the global war on terror, emphasizing military power, the controversial doctrine of preemption, and a distinct preference for unilateralism, or coalitions of the willing, over broad international consensus.
So a much harder-edged approach.
Definitely. The primary objective of this war on terror was to destroy the al-Qaeda network and its leading figures, notably Osama bin Laden and his deputy, the Egyptian-born Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, both directly associated with 9/11 and earlier bombings of American embassies in East Africa in 1998 and the USS Cole in 2000.
And al-Qaeda itself, where did it come from?
It's worth noting al-Qaeda's origins. Many of its core members were battle-hardened by their experiences fighting the Soviet-occupying force in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Ironically, the network was created during that time and actually funded and armed by American, Pakistani, and Saudi sources as part of the Cold War proxy fight against the Soviets.
The blowback phenomenon.
A classic case of blowback. However, they became outraged by America's placement of troops on the Arabian Peninsula, particularly Saudi Arabia, during and after the 1991 Persian Gulf War, which they saw as a desecration of Holy Land. This led them to seek to target American interests around the world and forge connections with local Islamist insurrections in Southeast Asia, Southeast Europe, and Russian-occupied Chechnya.
What's fascinating here, looking back, is how quickly the international community's initial overwhelming sympathy for the 9/11 victims seemed to turn into widespread disapproval, or opprobrium, as the source puts it, regarding the war on terror strategy itself. Why was that shift so pronounced?
You're right, the shift was stark and relatively quick. While most governments were swift to express international sympathy and solidarity immediately after the 9/11 attacks, NATO invoked its Collective Defense Clause for the first time ever. The manner in which the Bush administration constructed and implemented the war on terror strategy attracted considerable disapproval from many quarters, including close allies.
What were the main criticisms?
For critics, the assault on Iraq in 2003, which lacked explicit UN Security Council authorization for invasion, the use of indiscriminate torture at facilities like Abu Ghraib, and the establishment of controversial detention camps, such as Camp X-Ray and Delta at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, all pointed to a worrying lack of regard for international law and established conventions like the Geneva Conventions. While there is an emerging global consensus, as we discussed with R2P, that established principles like non-intervention might be constrained when confronting overwhelming evidence of human rights violations, the role of international legitimacy is still considered absolutely crucial for maintaining prevailing doctrines and the existing geopolitical architecture. Acting unilaterally or seemingly outside the law erodes that legitimacy. The Bush administration's decision to implement a doctrine of preemption was a specific and major concern.
Explain preemption again.
This doctrine reserved the right for the United States to take military action against non-state groups and fruiterous states, which is simply perceived as hostile or as potential future threats, rather than waiting for an actual attack to occur or be demonstrably imminent. It's a shift from deterrence or containment to proactive military intervention based on perceived future risk.
A lower threshold for war, essentially.
That was the fear. Geopolitically, these actions by the United States also indicated an increased adoption of extraterritoriality, applying U.S. power and sometimes law outside its borders, which directly threatened to undermine important principles associated with non-interference and national sovereignty, the very principles the U.S. often championed elsewhere. The national security strategies published in 2002 and 2005 were quite clear in this regard, stating bluntly that the United States will not wait to be attacked again. Creating these garrisons of extraterritoriality, such as the U.S. naval station at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba territory, leased indefinitely but outside full U.S. legal jurisdiction, specifically to circumvent American constitutional protections for detainees, gave rise to considerable international and domestic concern. As the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben noted, this seemed to indicate that a state of exception, where normal laws are suspended, was becoming the norm in an era characterized as a perpetual war on terror. A legal black hole. That's exactly what critics called it. Imagine a space where normal rules simply don't apply to certain individuals. This meant that, in the case of the United States, a state of emergency was used to justify the degradation, the legal status of individuals captured in the conflict, thereby producing legally unnameable and unclassifiable beings. For instance, the men captured in Afghanistan by American forces in November 2001 were neither classified as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, which would grant them certain rights, nor accorded the status of people charged with crimes according to American laws, which would grant other due process rights. They were in limbo. The practice of extraordinary rendition also became a major point of contention.
What was that exactly?
This process involved the secret transfer of suspected al-Qaeda prisoners from locations in Central Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere, often to third countries known to use torture or to CIA black sites. It implicated a host of other countries, including Britain, in facilitating and/or supporting a process that sought not only to isolate individuals geographically and legally from rules and conventions designed to protect prisoners, but also to transfer them to this legal and geographical state of exception.
To get information outside legal constraints.
That was the rationale given. If some of this sounds Kafkaesque, our source suggests reading the shocking biogeographical account of a British citizen, Moazzam Beg, in his book Enemy Combatant.
What did he describe?
His book offers a first-hand look at being caught in this system. He describes how he was extracted from Pakistan, then taken to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, and finally transported to Camp X-Ray in Cuba. The cells there were tellingly labeled Somalia, Lebanon, USS Cole, Nairobi, Twin Towers, and Pentagon names associated with terror attacks against U.S. targets, as if simply listing these places justified the nature of the detention. Questioned by American and British security officials, he struggled for years to establish his innocence. Labels such as illegal combatant or enemy combatant were horribly effective in denying him and hundreds of others an opportunity to even establish what charges, if any, were being brought against them, and the nature of the evidence. It raises a chilling question. Imagine the horror and outrage if an American citizen, or indeed, as some critics contended, a white British citizen rather than a British Asian-like Beg, was held by another country under similar circumstances, denied access to any due legal process. Tragically, some of his fellow inmates were unable to cope with this state of exception and took their own lives, and others attempted to do so. The key insight is that these actions, taken in the name of security, had immense human costs and significantly damaged the legal and ethical framework the U.S. claimed to uphold. The damage done to the prevailing geopolitical architecture by these actions has arguably been considerable. Even Francis Fukuyama, who, as we mentioned, once lauded the triumph of U.S.-sponsored neoliberalism, later recorded his profound dissatisfaction with this state of affairs. He found it truly shocking that the country responsible for establishing the United Nations and championing human rights accords was simultaneously engaging in the abuse of international law, demonstrating a lack of restraint and adopting indiscriminate violence.
That's quite a turnaround from the end of history. What specifically disillusioned him?
Fukuyama explains that his support for the neoconservative intellectuals who had heavily informed Bush's global strategy drained away. This was due to several factors. What he saw as the ill-considered assault on Iraq, the failure to anticipate or appreciate the violent reaction against the United States and the Middle East that followed, the administration's perceived unwillingness to seriously help resolve the Israeli-Palestine question, and the glaring lack of adequate consideration given to post-conflict reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan after U.S. bombing missions and invasions.
So, strategic blunders and ethical failings.
That was his assessment. He concluded that doctrines such as preemption, regime change by force, and unilateralism are unlikely to be sustainable in the longer term and are certainly not a viable replacement for international law, the United Nations, and institutions like the International Criminal Court, which the U.S. administration actively rejected and even sought to undermine. Indeed, the national security strategy of 2002 explicitly showed a kind of contempt for international forums, believing that they were primarily used by weaker states intent on restraining the United States and its global mission to eradicate terror.
What's fascinating here is how the Bush Doctrine, with its stark "you are either with us or against us" reasoning, had tangible geopolitical consequences far beyond the immediate targets like al-Qaeda or Iraq, influencing entire regions and relationships.
Absolutely. The Bush Doctrine, based on preemption and this highly selective form of multilateralism, coalitions of the willing, is described in our sources as the single most important danger confronting the geopolitical architecture at that time. The president's use of simplistic binary reasoning, such as "you are either with us or against us," had profound and very tangible geopolitical implications across the globe.
How did that play out on the ground?
Well, states and regions, depending on their perceived compliance with this doctrine, were either rewarded with financial and military support or faced consequences, pressure, or neglect. For instance, some states in the Horn of Africa and East Africa, such as Djibouti, Kenya, and Ethiopia, became significant beneficiaries of counterterrorism funding and military cooperation because they were seen as key partners in the regional fight against militants linked to al-Qaeda. Beyond the immediate war on terror, there was also a clear resource interest interwoven with security concerns. The prospect of untapped oil reserves in the Gulf of Guinea, off the coast of West Africa, for example, invited additional American interest and led to new investment patterns in military partnerships in West and Central Africa.
Security and energy intertwined.
Very much so. While the war on terror provided a geopolitical template or justification, the continent of Africa itself was tellingly described as a major security threat in the National Security Strategy of 2002. This was primarily because of the high numbers of so-called weak or failing states perceived as either unwilling or unable to control flows of people, money, and potential terror activities across their porous borders. Such a bleak assessment encouraged the Bush administration to establish in 2004 the PAN-SOL initiative, allocating $100 million initially, plus some increases in funding from the Millennium Challenge Account, another U.S. aid program. This initiative specifically involved Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger in defense cooperation and training with American forces, explicitly designed to halt the movement of Islamic militants across the vast Sahel region. But beyond the explicit pursuit of terror networks, it's crucial to understand, as our sources stress, that there are also deeper politico-economic reasons driving contemporary American foreign policy. The world has changed greatly since 1945, and the decision of the Roosevelt administration to help establish that post-war world order based on the United Nations and a global economy open to American trade and investment.
How has it changed?
Well, for one, the U.S. economy is now heavily indebted, often relying on foreign creditors. Meanwhile, China is rapidly emerging as arguably the world's most powerful economy, even if not yet militarily. China is already attracting the largest amounts of foreign direct investment, or FDI, and is the second biggest spender on arms after the United States. Moreover, China holds a massive amount. Our source mentions $300 billion back then. It's much higher now in U.S. Treasury bonds, giving it a huge vested interest in avoiding an economic conflict with the United States. Their economies are deeply intertwined.
And both have huge appetites for resources, right?
Massive appetites. Both economies have substantial resource needs, particularly energy. And it is perhaps unsurprising that American actions in Iraq and the wider Middle East have been widely interpreted by critics as part of a geopolitical strategy to maximize access to, or at least influence over, oil and natural gas reserves. America became heavily dependent on imported oil and has sought to exploit resources not only in the Middle East, but also in Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia, especially the Caspian Sea region. A 2006 report by the influential Council on Foreign Relations, entitled National Security Consequences of U.S. Oil Dependency, explicitly urged the Bush administration to diversify its energy sources away from volatile regions and promote energy efficiency and investment in renewable sources. Meanwhile, China's energy needs are also rapidly increasing. It was estimated back then that by 2025, China would require 11 million barrels of oil per day. That's roughly the entire production of Russia at the time, representing a huge increase from 2005 levels.
So China's scrambling for resources too.
Unsurprisingly, yes. Chinese foreign direct investment has been carefully targeting resource-rich countries such as Iran, Angola, and Sudan as it seeks to secure additional oil, gas, and minerals around the world, often offering infrastructure deals with fewer political strings attached than Western aid. Unlike the 1970s, which saw a supply shock due to OPEC embargoes disrupting oil production, the 2000s witnessed a form of demand shock, as emerging economies like China and India faced rapidly rising industrial and domestic demand for power generation and transportation. This fundamental shift in demand dynamics creates a whole new layer of geopolitical complexity, leading inevitably to intensified competition for finite resources.
That's a huge shift in global dynamics. And speaking of energy and demand, what's fascinating here is Russia's reassertion of influence during this period, particularly using its energy resources as a geopolitical tool. How was that playing out back then?
Indeed. In the mid-2000s, Russia's state-owned energy corporations, particularly the giant Gazprom, were clearly exerting greater influence on their near neighbors, countries like Belarus and Ukraine, that were heavily dependent on Russian gas transiting through pipelines on their territory.
Using energy as a weapon.
That's certainly how it was perceived by many in Europe. This reassertion was greatly encouraged by high global energy prices and rising demand, coupled with Russia's control of crucial pipeline networks connecting Siberian fields to European markets. Russia demonstrably used this control of supply, cutting off gas temporarily to Ukraine in disputes over pricing and transit fees to reassert itself politically in its former sphere of influence and on the global stage. Moreover, Moscow began to pressure foreign energy companies operating within Russia to accept new strictures over ownership and investment, seeking greater state control over strategic assets.
A reversal of the 1990s trends.
A significant reversal. However, our source also cautions that this apparent bonanza for Russia might not last indefinitely. Russia's energy supplies, particularly new ones in harsh Arctic environments, are often expensive to exploit, and other major suppliers were emerging. For example, Qatar was rapidly scaling up its production of liquefied natural gas, LNG, which is transported via specialized tankers and thus isn't dependent on fixed pipeline access control by Russia. The European Union, acutely concerned over Russia's reliability as a supplier after these disruptions, produced a new energy strategy around 2007. This strategy was specifically intended to diversify energy supplies away from overdependence on Russia and promote renewable sources in the face of these external uncertainties. The EU even suggested it might invest further in LNG terminal facilities so that it could receive greater supplies from places like Qatar and potentially help develop South American sources in countries like Bolivia, Peru, and Venezuela, although those came with their own political complexities. This proactive stance highlights a growing global competition for energy security and a potential shift away from traditional pipeline politics towards a more diversified, albeit still competitive, energy landscape. This scramble for resources, as our sources describe it, is really reminiscent of the scramble for colonial territories back in the 19th century, and it has important implications for the prevailing geopolitical architecture. Some analysts genuinely feared and still fear that the next generation of wars will be triggered precisely by competition for resource access.
Where were the potential flashpoints seen then?
The Caspian Sea region, with its vast untapped oil and gas reserves bordering Russia, Iran, and several Central Asian states, was frequently described as a potential flashpoint, alongside the long-standing extra-regional power interest in conflict in the Middle East. While the United States and China were extending their military and financial interest into these regions, seeking access and influence, Russian geopolitical analysts were clearly alarmed at the buildup of Western and Chinese investments in the Caspian, a region still considered part of Russia's near-abroad or traditional sphere of influence. The Russian government, feeling more confident due to high energy prices, also became more aggressive in renegotiating pricing and access terms for natural gas in neighboring countries, like the disputes with Ukraine, and sought to impose new controls on foreign investment in energy exploration and exploitation within its own oil-rich regions like Siberia. It became common to read within Russian geopolitical circles the sentiment that the country should leverage its substantial energy resources to secure a greater global presence and challenge U.S. dominance.
So energy equals power.
Very directly. The conclusion seemed clear back then and arguably still holds. As access to energy resources becomes an ever more important determinant of wider global political patterns, territorial competition and competition over pipelines, sea lanes, and investment rights will only intensify. And crucially, a continued heavy American military presence in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia, often justified by counterterrorism but closely linked to energy interests, provides further grist to the mill for Islamic militants who deeply resent the presence of American companies and armed forces in the Middle East and wider Islamic world, framing it as neo-colonial occupation.
This raises an important and often debated question. Is this level of U.S. activity, with its extensive military spending, global network of bases, and frequent interventions, indicative of imperial behavior? It's a loaded term, empire, but does it fit the reality described?
It's a debate that was definitely triggered by America's actions, particularly after 9/11. At that time, America continued to be the dominant force shaping global geopolitics. Now, the war on terror certainly provoked substantial increases in military spending and counter-terror investment around the world, expanding U.S. reach. This inevitably fueled significant discussion about whether this level of activity was indicative of imperial behavior.
How did different sides see it?
Well, for some neoconservative commentators, such as Max Boot, terms like empire actually became badges of honor. They suggested it was evidence that Americans had not only the right, but perhaps even the duty to act imperially, using their power for the greater good, as they defined it, while simultaneously securing their national interests, spreading democracy and free markets by force if necessary. Critics naturally saw it very differently. They contended that imperial America was engaged in a modern form of colonial and indeed racist project designed to subjugate regions and citizens in the global South for the benefit of political and business elites operating in and beyond the United States. Exploitation dressed up as liberation.
So a sharp divide. What about academic scholars?
Scholars remain deeply divided on whether the United States was, or is, behaving in a truly imperial manner. For instance, in their influential though dense book Empire, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri claim that a farrago of actors, a complex mix of powerful states like America, private firms, and international governmental organizations, work together, not necessarily under any single hegemonic control from Washington, to regulate and protect a global market system. In their terms, empire is a decentralized global rule apparatus that is not tied to one particular territorial center, such as the United States. It's a more networked, less centralized form of control.
Different take.
Yes. On the other hand, the sociologist Michael Mann, in his analysis of America's imperial ambitions, concluded that America does not have imperial power in the traditional sense, lacking the will and resources for long-term occupation and control like past empires. He argued that a reliance on military solutions like bombing campaigns is, if anything, a sign of weakness, not strength, an inability to achieve goals through other means. This brings us back to Joseph Nye's concept of soft power.
Right. The power of attraction versus coercion.
Exactly. As Nye has pointed out, overwhelming military power, or hard power, is certainly useful for destroying opponents' armed forces and national infrastructure, but it is less likely to be helpful in resolving conflict and building long-term peace and stability. American cultural and political values, heavily promoted after the Cold War, had, by the mid-2000s, been openly and even violently rejected in many parts of the world. Widespread anti-Americanism in the Middle East and beyond clearly indicated a significant decline in what Nye describes as soft power, the ability to attract and co-opt rather than coerce through force or payment.
Did policymakers get that distinction?
Not always. Nye notes that skeptics of soft power, like former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who professed not even to understand the term, claimed popularity is ephemeral and shouldn't guide foreign policy. They asserted that the United States is strong enough to do as it wishes without the world's approval and should simply accept that others will envy and resent it. Rumsfeld famously argued that the world's only superpower does not need permanent allies. Rather, the issues should determine the coalitions, not vice versa. The mission determines the coalition. In the longer term, though, such a hegemonic presence, especially one relying heavily on hard power, is likely to be further conditioned by the growing economic presence and geopolitical priorities of rising powers like China and India and their corresponding resource needs. It's not difficult to imagine, for example, that the permanent membership of the UN Security Council might eventually have to change as other countries, such as India, Brazil, Nigeria, or Indonesia, demand recognition beyond the victors of World War II. Although it's worth noting that Japan's long-standing quest for a permanent seat at the Security Council is likely to continue to be thwarted by China.
So the architecture itself might need to adapt.
It might have to. The fundamental challenge for the United States going forward from that period was seen as holding on to a legitimacy that had been severely eroded by the Bush administration in its relentless pursuit of those who carried out the September 11, 2001 attacks, and particularly by the Iraq War. Any short-term advantage, whether economic or political, gained from such a strategy was seen as likely to be counteracted by longer-term damage to America's reputation and that of its close partners, such as Britain, around the world. Soft power is hard to rebuild once lost.
So bringing it all together, what does this all mean for you, our listener? Thinking about the world today, what are the biggest takeaways from this deep dive into geopolitics, globalization, and these shifting power dynamics?
Well, for you, it means understanding that the world you live in is shaped by this incredibly complex interplay of forces we've discussed. The Bush administration's apparent disdain for the existing geopolitical architecture and international law, particularly during the War on Terror, undeniably fueled expressions of anti-Americanism far beyond the Middle East and the Islamic world. It also, perhaps surprisingly, enabled populist governments in Latin America, like those of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia at the time, to play a significant part in exposing what they called American imperialism and proclaiming an alternative axis of good at the expense of the United States and its allies, finding common cause with other U.S. rivals. These oil and natural gas-rich nations, Venezuela, Bolivia, Iran, Russia, were able to challenge and at times mock the United States, seemingly safe in the knowledge that the American economy remained heavily addicted to imported oil and natural gas supplies, giving them leverage. To make matters worse, Iraqi oil production, despite its vast potential, remained underdeveloped for years due to the continued chaos and insurgency following the invasion, and a failure by the occupying powers and subsequent Iraqi governments to provide a stable legal and security framework that would encourage foreign companies to invest the billions needed to develop its wells and infrastructure.
So the intervention didn't even secure the oil effectively.
Ironically, no, not for a long time. And most disturbingly, perhaps, from an ethical and soft power perspective, this perceived American disregard for existing international bodies and conventions merely emboldened those Islamic militant critics who could, with some evidence from Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and civilian casualties, point to American disregard for human rights and a willingness to bomb, torture, and maim communities in the Middle East and the wider Islamic world.
Fueling the very narratives they claim to be fighting.
Precisely. As many critics, both Muslim and non-Muslim, will point out, tremendous cultural damage is done every time American personnel disregard the basic human dignity of others. Now, this is not in any way to diminish the horror perpetuated by Islamic militants themselves. Rather, it highlights how profoundly important it is for a superpower claiming moral leadership, like the United States, to be seen to be operating consistently to the highest national and international legal and ethical standards. So the geopolitical architecture we inhabit today still faces considerable challenges stemming from that era and continuing today. Anti-American sentiment, while perhaps evolving, persists alongside the activities of diverse anti-globalization movements, ongoing Islamic militancy in various forms, intense resource competition, and the undeniable rise of geopolitical challengers like China and a resurgent, if disruptive, Russia.
A very messy picture.
Extremely messy. The United States is the world's largest superpower for decades and also regarded as the primary champion of neoliberal forms of globalization, faces the fundamental problem of how to maintain its influence, regain international legitimacy where it's been lost, and perhaps reinvest in the very international public bodies like the UN and international law that actually helped it establish its hegemonic presence during the last century.
Can it do that?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? The colonial occupation of Iraq, as our source sparkly puts it, will stand as a historical marker of American hegemonic ambition in the early 21st century, one in which military presence was instrumental in attempting, largely unsuccessfully, to reshape another country's economic and political infrastructure by force. In their different ways, the rise of Chinese economic power and the persistence of Islamic militancy have demonstrated that the 21st century, at least according to the Christian calendar, is unlikely to be an unqualified American one. What does that future look like for you, navigating this increasingly complex, multipolar, and contested global landscape? That's the thought we leave you with today.